This is Floss Weekly. I'm Doc Searls, and our guest this week is Nick Vidal of Open Anniversary. And I can't tell you how many ways everything that has the heartbeat of anniversaries, of timelines, of involvement, of history is involved with this project. He's doing an amazing job of pulling a lot of stuff together. We've been at open source long enough to have a real history, and we're going to talk about it. That's coming up next.
Podcasts you love
from people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is Floss Weekly, episode 641, recorded Wednesday, August 4th, 2021, the Open Anniversary.
No ads, just the content. That's what you get when you join Club TWiT. You even get extras like TWiT Plus, our new bonus feed just for members, and exclusive access to the Club TWiT Discord community. Join now for just $7 a month and support TWiT as we continue to create top-notch podcasts you expect and deserve. We're just getting started, so be one of the first to join as we build Club TWiT from the ground up. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit to learn more and sign up now. Thanks.
Hello again. Good morning, good evening, and good whatever it is, wherever you are. I am Doc Searls, and this is Floss Weekly. And I'm joined this week by the great Shawn Powers, wearing blue to go with my red, and we'll bring in the green shortly. So how and where are you, Shawn?
I'm in my new office. I don't know if I've been on the show since I'm in my new office.
You brought this in last time, yeah. I think
Okay. And it looks just like my old office, except backwards. Well,
except the death ray is pointed at your head now.
Yeah.
Which it wasn't before.
It's motivation to get the work done, really, is what that is.
Yeah.
So, no, I'm in Michigan. I almost feel guilty here in Michigan. The weather is amazing. It's like in the mid to upper 70s. We had plenty of rain, but not too much. I don't know. I have like weather guilt because, half the country's burning and like flooding. And anyway, it's pretty great to live here now for these like 3 days of summer. I'm pretty sure it's going to snow tomorrow, and then, it'll be feet of snow for 10 months. But nonetheless, right now it's pretty nice.
It's like on Garrison Keillor's old show. He used to have a fake ad for a resort on the North Shore of Lake Superior where the slogan was, "Try to book the good weekend." So
that's not a joke. That's legitimate.
It's not a joke. That's what it is. I feel I get weather guilt about Santa Barbara, but I'm not there. I'm in New York, where it's not sweltering right now. I actually have windows and doors open, and I can get along without the AC, even though it's still hot. So our guest this week is Nick Vidal of Open Anniversary. Are you familiar yet with what he's about and what he's doing?
Yeah, I didn't realize all of the anniversaries in the open source world that are kind of happening. So it should be great to just, talk about all the things that have happened and continue to keep happening. So it's kind of exciting. I hadn't realized until I looked at the website and stuff. So it should be some good conversation about stuff that's going on.
Yeah, I'm most aware of the of open source because it wasn't really used as a term except in the military before 1998. But we could retroactively go back to earlier anniversaries because of things that are open source, and so there's a lot of meat there to go into. So let me go ahead and jump into it and introduce him. Nick Vidal is the founder of Open Anniversary, an innovative and inclusive platform for the community to remember, celebrate, and reimagine the open source movement. He's currently a community manager at a stealth startup related to confidential computing, and previously worked with the open source initiative, Open Invention Network, and the Drupal community. So welcome, Nick. Good to have you on the show.
Thank you, Doc. It's a pleasure to be here. In fact, we're celebrating several anniversaries, and I'm happy to share and celebrate together with you.
Thank you. So, I know you can't talk about your stealth startup. We'll all several thousand of us will try to forget that we heard that. So tell us a bit more about your background. Do you come out of computer science or whatever? And also tell us where in the world you are right now. We always want to know that stuff.
Yeah, so I'm actually pretty jealous of Shawn because, in fact, I'm in Brazil, Porto Alegre. It's supposed to be warm, hot here. We're famous for that, but right now it's raining. It's quite cold. As you know, it's winter time here, and looks like Shawn is in a better place right now. But it will soon be sunnier here. And so my background is I did computer engineering at the university, and I just fell in love with open source. I started with the Drupal community. This is where I learned the power of really the community, of collaboration, of open source. I've later worked with the Open Invention Network. That's the largest patent integration community in the world. And I met a lot of good folks there. And later, I had the honor to celebrate the 20 years of open source together with the Open Source Initiative. So we actually organized over 100 activities across 40 events worldwide. This was in 2018. We were celebrating the 20 years of open source and a whole bunch of other anniversaries. And this is how I fell in love with that as well, learning a bit more of the history of open source, free software, and that's how Open Anniversary came to be.
So how big is your crew there? Is it a one-man show, or do you have a bunch of people involved? Tell us a little bit more about how you're organized.
Yeah, right now it's a one-man crew. It's a nonprofit. It's actually part of the Open Source Collective. This is it's a physical host, and we actually participated in a funding campaign called FundOS. And it's right now it's a one-man show, but we're inviting people to join and to help create those timelines.
This may end up being off topic, but since you're in Brazil, and I should have checked on that first, do you know John Mad Dog Hall? Because I know he's been down there a lot. He's worked with people.
Oh, yeah. He's very much involved here. I'm also part of the organizing committee of FISLI, the International Free Software Forum. This is one very popular, it was one very popular conference in Brazil with 7,000 to 10,000 participants. And Mad Dog is always present in all open source conferences here in Brazil. There's also Campus Party with 10,000 participants. Campus Party is quite funny because it's people that go actually camp inside this 1 week conference, and they play games, they learn about open source, they discuss blockchain, and it's pretty fun. And Mad Dog is always present here. He's very active.
I get the impression, because the times I've been in Brazil have been for Carnival, of course, and basically for parties. Mm-hmm. I mean, my entire one conference and a couple of parties, yeah. Basically. The conference was in Brasilia, but the parties were in Sao Paulo and Rio, and mm-hmm. But it seems to be talking to Mad Dog that I think I may be wrong about this, but in Brazil, if you have a choice between a conference and a party, you'll go for a party or for a celebration of some kind. Is that too broad a characterization? But it sort of feels that way to me.
I think it's both, actually. If you can go for a conference that has a party inside of it, that's what happens. And that's exactly how we run our events. The best of both worlds, right?
Yeah. So I'm looking down the list here. There's John. For those of you watching, mm-hmm. There's Mad Dog. And that's from Faces of Open Source. And I'm in there too. I like John's picture better. I look way too serious, but it's we want to have that guy on as well, the person who does that. Mm-hmm. A brilliant photographer. So I'm looking down the list of what you've got. You've got 30 years of Linux, 30 years of the first website and public announcement of the World Wide mm-hmm. Web, 20 years of Wikipedia, 20 years of Creative Commons, 25 years of the Internet Archive, important thing, 20 years of the Wayback mm-hmm. Machine, 35 years of Aaron Swartz in memory of, and oh my God, think of him as 35. I met him when he was like 14.
Yeah.
And and I was extraordinarily fond of him. Important guy. 15 years of the Sunlight Foundation. I suppose I could go on. Which of those? There are a couple directions I want to go with this. I don't want to keep Shawn out of the conversation either. But part of this is the a chance to celebrate. But part of it is there are causes here. There are movements. There are values that were born in this. I think especially of Aaron. Things that people stood for in the first place, and keeping those alive, because it's easy to take Wikipedia for granted or the Internet Archive for granted, and to lose track of why we actually need those things. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of the tug between the need to celebrate and have a party, and the need to revisit what it was that got things going in the first place.
That's exactly the case of what happened. So while at the OSI, I worked together with the general manager, was Patrick Masson, and also the whole OSI board of directors. And we wanted to celebrate the 20 years of open source. And so we saw, how are we going to be able to do that? We were just two full-time staff members, me and Patrick. The board members, they had some time, was volunteer time, and we wanted to celebrate this. We didn't have much money to go toward this, and so what we did was we worked together with several organizers, conference organizers from all around the world to help to celebrate this. And it was not just about celebrating open source. It was about understanding what happened 20 years ago, and much more than that. The whole history behind free software and Linux that came before the open source term was coined, and how we could learn from that, and how we could build a future open source community. And we discussed several other important topics while celebrating. We talked about open source sustainability. We talked about creating healthy open source communities. How can we create a community that's it welcomes everyone. It promotes diversity and inclusion. So it was a really great learning experience for everyone. And I just loved this whole experience. And that's why I decided to continue. And I've been meeting a lot of people as well to celebrate this and to share the history and to imagine a new future. So for the Linux 30th anniversary, I've been working with the Linux Professional Institute. They're organizing several activities as well. So yeah, it's a wonderful experience for everyone, I hope.
So I'm curious, the notion of celebration, the notion of parties, anniversaries, all that stuff really draws attention to a topic. I'm curious if you've found that just the notion of celebrating these things have given you or your group an opportunity to expand open source. Has it opened any doors? Has it drawn attention in areas that maybe haven't been paying attention? Or has it been an opportunity at all just to kind of pushing the open source agenda? Sounds like a negative thing. I don't mean it that way, but to push the ideals, to spread the ideals of open source. Has this been a boon? I mean, or are we just navel gazing? I mean, are we just like, yay us? Or have you found that this is a way to bring even more people into the community?
That's an excellent question. In 2018, I'm not sure if you remember, the Commons Clause came to be, and also the server-side public license. These were two licenses that were trying to redefine what's open source. And in fact, they were kind of attacking the definition of the understanding of the definition of open source. And this was why we were celebrating the 20 years of open source. So us at the OSI, we took this opportunity to really talk about what's open source. We actually have 10 principles that define what's open source. And this has been very important for the last 20 years. And so this discussion was really important throughout the whole year of 2018, while we were having a few startups trying to redefine what's open source. And at the end of that tour around the world, we actually had affiliates from the open source initiative who signed a letter defending the open source definition. We had a final letter with, I believe, 50 affiliates of the OSI signing that up. And so it was really important to talk with the whole open source community around the world to defend the open source. And I think that's an important role from the OSI to really defend that. And people will always try to redefine what's open source. There's a lot of interests around that. And we have to understand why we have those 10 principles, why also the Free Software Foundation, it has the 4 principles of the free software, why those exist, and how we can maintain that. Of course, it's always welcome to, I wouldn't say redefine, but to try to make it better. So we have a lot of problems with free software and open source, especially the communities around diversity and inclusion, around sustainability. How can we work that better, but without throwing everything away, right? So,
okay, that couldn't have been a better segue. My next question to you was going to be, first of all, just to point out that, I mean, open source is all about community, right? Open source is about people, probably more so than software or hardware. It is about the community of people that we have. I'm curious. I'm in the U.S. I have very limited exposure outside of the U.S. when it comes to the community. I'm curious if you have noticed or experienced different regions, different cultures adopting the open source mentality and the community, if the communities are more apt to get along, for lack of a better way to put it. I'm just curious if diversity is such a key component to our open source community, because open source levels the playing field, that I'm just curious if you have experience with, you're in Latin America, you're in Brazil, the communities there versus communities in the US. Do you find it easier, more difficult? Do the communities work together? Or is that something that you don't have the experience like in other communities outside of where you are? I'm just curious how the communities get along. I don't know if there's a question in there.
So actually, there's a stereotype that maybe here in Latin America we're more passionate. Like Doug asked, we're more into parties and celebrating. In a way, yes, that's true. But there's also a lot of very serious people who are very technique-wise. They really understand this, and they can be quite serious as well. And I do think each community around the world, they have their own style, their own personality. We can't generalize, but we do see this. So I'm enjoying very much learning about Asia, open source in Asia. So we didn't have many OSI board members in Asia until recently. So while we were celebrating, we had to partner with several events and communities there. We participated together with FLOSS Asia and also with the open source, China Open Source Conference. And they were very creative on organizing those celebrations. So one fun fact, the China Open Source Conference, we sent one of the board members there, Tony, and they actually organized together a party. They had a cake, and everybody was wearing a Jedi cap. And from my perspective, I will look at the Asian community like very serious. I wouldn't imagine them playing around, but actually they did a cosplay. So everybody was wearing a Jedi cap, and they had a cake on the middle to celebrate the 20 years of open source. And everybody had a saber, and they cut the cake with the saber. And that was very fun, very creative. So I think it's about communities. There's a lot of stereotypes, but everybody has their own personality, each individual, and we can't generalize. But I always learn to how each community behaves and embrace that. So yeah.
So I'm wondering. So you have all of these celebrations. You actually have one per month this year, and you can see those on the website. I'm wondering if there's a given format. I mean, do you start with, okay, we always do it this way, or do you improvise it and do it a little bit different each time? What's your approach with that?
Yeah. So actually, the initial idea, I started this before the pandemic, and the initial idea was to have anyone being able to create celebrations and actual events happening. But of course, that didn't happen. So last year, for example, we celebrated several important milestones. It was the 25th anniversary of JavaScript, the 25th anniversary of Java as well, the Apache HTTP project was also celebrating their 20th anniversary. PHP was celebrating their anniversary as well. Actually, the whole LAMP stack, with the exception of Linux. So we have Apache, MySQL, and PHP. And we wanted to celebrate that. I was trying to organize, but in March, the pandemic hits, and we didn't have any actual physical celebrations, in-person celebrations. The last events that we participated in was Scale and Git commits. Those are events that were happening in California. So we celebrated there the 15th anniversary of Git. I worked together with GitHub and GitLab to celebrate those. And that was the last event that happened in person, right? And my hope is that perhaps in the next few months or next year, we'll be able to return and celebrate in person. I'm sure everybody is hoping for that, to celebrate those conferences in person. But in a way, Open Anniversary is a way for us to remember. It's a fun timeline, or we have 12 timelines right now, one for each month. And it's a fun way to review the history and to remember and to dream about those in-person conferences that will be happening next year.
So you brought up the pandemic, and I'm wondering if there's it seems like everybody has a learning experience coming out of the pandemic. It's a little different for everybody, but it's such a radical thing that happened, and it's kind of like put a big reset button on almost everything. And I'm wondering if you could generalize a bit on what you've learned about it, or you're still learning about everything from that experience of, like, we can't all get together. We're doing this thing on Zoom or whatever other tools they're using.
Yeah, so people think of the open source community much like developers working together over the internet, and perhaps it wouldn't be much affected by not having in-person conferences, but that's definitely not the case. The open source community has been hit really hard around that. Speaking from the OSI's perspective, we were affected because we relied a lot on participating in conferences around the world, even for fundraising. I know the Drupal community as well has been affected. This year, we're also celebrating the 30 years of the Python language, and the Python Software Foundation has also been affected by this. And not just in terms of fundraising, but bringing together developers and the whole community actually to work together and to sync ideas. The pandemic has really hit hard on the whole open source community. But it has also brought everybody together in terms of collaborating and make sure we're still strong. So there has been a lot of companies sponsoring and helping those communities. At Open Source Collective as well, it has have a lot of a good fundraising opportunities as well. And people have relied on their internet to share ideas. But as you know, in person, it really is important for everybody.
It is. And, you know, I think that one of the things the pandemic has shown us as a species, I guess, globally, is that thankfully technology is to a point now where we can have some interaction if we can't be in person. I'm curious if you have, you know, there's these celebrations happening. Is there a way, or is there a central clearinghouse, or how can people participate? Right? How can I participate? I mean, you know, I have whiskey downstairs, even if it's involving that kind of a party. But what can we do so that the community, the global community, can be involved together and somehow use the technology that we're so passionate about to be able to share in the celebration? I mean, have there been actual online events? And if so, can you share those links and those sites and how people can participate, even if it's just viewing? I mean, you know, I'm an introvert anyway. I don't really want to leave my office. I like my office, but I like to participate even if it's just, you know, viewing what is happening other places. So is there a place, and if so, can you share that so we can put it in the show notes, which I'll do this cool thing. It'll be right below, assuming it exists.
Yeah, of course. So actually, I mentioned the Python community celebrating 30 years, and also the Drupal community celebrated 20 years. And these events, they had conferences, in-person conferences, and they had to become virtual. And a lot of these celebrations did happen virtually. I know that the Linux Foundation is organizing an in-person celebration for the Open Source Summits coming up in the end of September, early October. The Linux Professional Institute is also organizing some celebrations around the Software Freedom Day happening in September. And the Open Source Initiative is also organizing but this time an online conference called Practical Open Source Information. So there has been a mix right now, hybrid events, online events. We might have some in-person events. And what I would ask for the audience is about what you can do in the pandemic. You can read a lot. You can read books. You can read over the internet. You can talk with people online. So I would recommend reading about the history of open source and other celebrations that we're having. If you want to actually suggest a milestone on Open Anniversaries website, you can do that. And the goal behind Open Anniversaries is actually to go beyond just those timelines. It will be to allow people to create those milestones and to create those timelines and to make it very dynamic. My hope is for every open source community, every open source project to have their own timeline there at one point. So those are some online activities that you can do. But like everyone else, I'm hoping for in-person celebrations, and I'm looking forward towards that as well.
It's funny. So I'm going to be the contrary person here. I really enjoy that conferences have had to make adjustments. It's difficult for me to go to lots of conferences, but being able to participate remotely is pretty cool. That said, I mean, there is a lot to be said for in-person anything, right? I mean, we're social creatures. We need to socialize with other people. But it seems like a technology-based thing, open source is the perfect entryway to be able to include people, a diverse set of people all over the globe using this technology. And so I'm actually a little bit excited that it's forced us to think digitally as well as in-person community. And again, I'm not knocking the idea that local communities of people need to be together, and conferences in person are great. But I think that it's going to be a long-term plus for the open source community, for the community in general, that we can have conversations like this that before were, I don't know, kind of niche, right? I mean, having a Zoom party isn't something anybody would have done 3 years ago. But now it's almost commonplace. I mean, you see non-technical people, as one little window, and they forget they're on video, and they take their laptop to the bathroom, which that's a whole other story. But it's just neat that everybody is able to participate. So I'm excited about that aspect of it. I'll check out the website more thoroughly too. I did see the timeline. I didn't realize it was interactive. I didn't realize that we could participate in the actual website and adding things. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, so actually you brought a very important discussion. We know that there's a lot of people who can't travel, either financially or for physical reasons. We have people, for example, with disabilities, and they can't travel. And before the pandemic, they were quite invisible. We didn't see them, and we didn't make those in-person conferences accessible to them. And I think one important thing about the pandemic is bringing that discussion up. How can we make both our online and in-person and hybrid events more inclusive and more accessible? And not just the conferences, the whole work structure. How can we make work more accessible to anyone? Like working moms that have babies. So in the beginning of the show, you heard a crying baby. That was my son here. So my wife is with him. How can we make those events, be it online, be it hybrid, in person, whatever, how can we make work, how we can make all those activities more accessible to everyone, independent of where they are from, how they are, what are their abilities or disabilities. So that's a very important point that you brought up. Yeah.
It's interesting. We put on a conference twice a year called the Internet Identity Workshop, and it's always in Silicon Valley at the Computer History Museum, and we've had 30 some now, I think 2 a year. And of course, with the pandemic, we had to improvise, and we took it online, and it grew enormously, and people were still willing to pay. I mean, it's not an expensive conference; it's cheaper than most, I think. In part because we're not paying any talent. We're not. We don't have keynotes and that. In fact, it's very open. It's called open space. That's the approach. It's basically an unconference. But going back and forth is really weird because we're thinking there's a lot of pressure to do it in a hybrid way. You want to be live and you want to be physically there as well. And it seems to me is actually almost a choice of you have to do it one way or the other. So I think we're leaning now toward alternating them. We'll have one that's virtual and one that's physical. But I don't know how it's going to work physically because people, companies are not paying for travel like they used to. In the same way as they're not. A company, New York now, employment is back up to normal. And yet there's 20% drop in occupancy in office buildings. And I'm sure that number is low. And in part because the offices are still there, but a lot of people are only working in the offices a day or two a week or maybe 3, but not the whole week, people are finding out they're more productive at home. And that, to me, is also kind of typical of open source. Everybody working in open source, they're working on their own gear, and they're doing it in their houses and their apartments and on their laps. And it's one of the ways that I think that the open source value system is kind of seeping its way into the way business is done, even the way government's done. Personal independence, autonomy, a meritocracy about the way code gets included, a lot of those things. And so I just wanted to add that because I think we're all kind of learning at the same time.
The other thing too, Doc.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Go for it.
I'm excited to talk about this too.
I just want to pause to say, for those watching, we've carefully arranged ourselves as RGB, red, green, and blue. So you'll have to imagine I'm in red, Nick is green, and
I'm wearing my.
Oh, and he's got his OSI shirt.
Yeah.
Mine says Freedom to Connect, and it's from a conference in 2008.
Yeah.
So very good. There it shows. And
mine is just blue. I have no cool thing about it.
At least it's not your mood. So go ahead, Shawn. You were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say, so you mentioned like you're thinking about going every other, like a live conference and then a virtual conference because a hybrid is rough to work out. But I wanted to point out too that while I think, yes, people are more productive at home, and we're seeing, again, the pandemic has allowed us to see exactly how people can work remotely and still be very effective. The other nice thing for conferences is that we almost get the Netflix effect, right? We can go to a conference after it's already over, if it's designed to be virtual or even a hybrid model, if it's recorded and the information is there to consume at a later time, it allows you to have timing flexibility too. I don't know if you've been in Zoom meetings with people around the globe, but I've had to wake up at 1 a.m. to attend a meeting. And while that's awesome that it can work that way, it's also nice for virtual conferences that take place in other parts of the world. I can watch them at my leisure. I can participate at my leisure. And there can even be an interactive portion of that after the fact, like with posts or comments or forums or whatever. I think that it gives us the ability to get more mileage out of these online events than we could if we just like live stream them. I love live streams. There's something specific about seeing a person as they're actually talking. Like all the people in the live stream now, they get to see me actually talk, and and they don't get the pleasure of me being edited out like everybody else will get. But no. But seriously, that ability to go back and rewatch or pause and all of that stuff is a real benefit that I don't think we would have fully realized, or at least it would have taken longer if the pandemic hadn't forced us to really think about what a virtual experience means. And so, again, I feel like I'm like pro-pandemic. That's not the case. I'm pro including people. And this was just a catalyst that was unfortunate, but I'm hoping that there's some good that comes out of it. And I think that's one of the examples of something that's really going to be a benefit to our community.
Yeah. So if we think about open source and how the community grew, how Linux was developed, how just about any open source project was developed, you rely a lot of online collaboration and the use of internet. And so the pandemic has really highlighted that, how people can actually work across the globe and together make something better and develop very complex software like the Linux operating system. And so it's not just about events, right? It's about hybrid work or remote work. It has really highlighted that. And it really completely changed our view around work and events and meetings. How can we conduct businesses online as well? How can we close deals online? So it's a very interesting period of time. And I think it just reinforces something that we, from the open source community, knew all along. Of course, we miss the in-person connections, but online really does work. And in some ways, it's better, right? It has the advantages and disadvantages.
I'm wondering, we're talking about the learning process we're all going through here. And I'm wondering about how you want to institutionalize what you're doing. Okay, it's 5 years from now. What does this become? Do you have a staff? Is it is it integrated into the heartbeat of some of the projects that you're interacting with, where they're coming up? Oh, geez, there's going to be an anniversary of killing this bug. I'm just making that up. I mean, there could be any particular thing, or some major version. Now we're at version 10. That kind of thing. I'm just wondering if you thought much about how that goes.
Yeah, so Open Anniversary started as a side project, and in a ways, it's still a side project. I actually had the opportunity to meet a lot of people because of this. So while celebrating the 20 years of Wikipedia, for example, I met a guy called Pete Forsyth, and he has a lot of connections with the Wikipedia, and maybe we could have this project as part of the Wikimedia Foundation, because it's a different way to visualize information. So it will just not be about open source or technology. It could be about anything. So I was talking about me being from Brazil, and you might be interested in what's the history in Brazil? Can you summarize that to me? What are the 20 most important milestones from the Brazilian history, or perhaps the 10 most important milestones? If we could somehow create this kind of new Wikipedia where everything is very visual, where we can, in a glance, understand different histories, either from open source movements or countries or whatever you can imagine, I think it would be a very good addition. So I'm still exploring this. It's very much a side project. It started out talking about open source, but it could be expanded to all kinds of topics. And let's see what happens. I don't know what's going to be 5 years from now, but I'm hoping that this will flourish somehow.
I'm wondering, there are some institutions involved. I mean, you've been involved with the OSI, but I'm thinking, I mean, in recent years, the Linux Foundation has become actually enormous, and obviously it deals with far more than Linux at this point. Are they looking, or anybody there looking to either partner with you or sort of start including some of the heartbeats that you're putting out there for these different projects, and including those in some way in whatever they're doing?
Yeah, I think perhaps the Wikipedia would be a better place, because I don't think it's just tech related. Right now, there's a very big focus on open source, but we could. This is a different way to visualize timelines and to visualize information, and I think Wikipedia would be a better foundation for that. But yeah, if we were to discuss only the history of open source or the history of Linux, I think the Linux Foundation could be a nice home for that, or even the OSI, right? This is where it started, and I've given thought to that as well, and the OSI is always willing to help, so maybe this will go back to the OSI somehow.
So I have a quick question here, because this is awesome, all the things that we're celebrating. How can we, like in this call, but also the community members that are listening or watching, or the live feed right now, how can we get involved? What is it that we can actually do, especially considering that because of the format of this show, we're literally all over the place. What is it that we can do to get involved? One, like I said earlier, when whoever, I think it was Ant that was showing the actual website, we can go to the website and add stories, milestones, etc. Are there other things that we can do to get involved and kind of spread the word, spread the celebrations, and hopefully spread the open source message using these celebrations as an excuse? What can we do? What's our call to action?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Open Anniversary is actually developed on top of Drupal, which is open source. And I'm making the code available open source, of course, so that anybody could make additions. And there's a way for people to add milestones currently, but we can make it much better. So it would be interesting if in the actual timeline, we could, clicking on each milestone, we could edit that and or add one or edit an entry. And that will be very similar to Wikipedia, how Wikipedia works. And so I'm still working on that. If people want to contact me, that'll be great. There's a contact form on the website. This is very much an open source project. We're starting, it was released this year, actually. And I would love to hear feedback from people on this. Okay,
so there's contact form on the website that we can reach out to you personally. Mm-hmm. Oh, look at that right there. It's a link. Okay. So thank you, Ant. I assume that's you again. We'll put that, make sure that's in the show notes too, like the website, and then remember to scroll down to the bottom to see how to reach out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you mentioned Mad Dog, and I'm wondering if there are other people who have who stand out for you as people you've talked to and have influenced what you're doing and have offered steady encouragement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the whole OSI board of directors, in fact, I have a very big appreciation for them. They volunteered their time to be part of the OSI. So there's just so many people, it would be very hard for me to name all of them. But I would point out the OSI board of directors. And in fact, there's a new executive director that is being brought to the OSI. So if people are really interested on open source, you can join and even help the OSI. I'm not sure if the news about the new executive director is live yet, but he just joined. It was this Monday. So this is a nice moment to get in touch with the OSI if you really care about open source. You mentioned the Linux Foundation. I also have a lot of appreciation for the Linux Foundation, all their work on expanding this open source model across different industries. So I'm kind of joining them, not exactly the Linux Foundation, but a project that's part of the Linux Foundation around confidential computing and the confidential computing consortium. And this is an area that is very important for the future of data protection. And they, of course, everyone knows about the CNCF, the cloud native, and how that's shaping several industries. And I would also like to highlight the work from the Linux Professional Institute, where Mad Dog is a director as well. They're also doing a lot of work on that sense. So, yeah, those are my inspirations. Those organizations and people that are part of those organizations.
So we have one question coming in from the back channel, which is how many timelines will you make? And I guess maybe the question there is actually, can groups of people start making their own timelines? That's good. Thank you, Ant, for putting that up there, because I can't watch two things at once. So I guess that's sort of the wiki-ish side of this thing. I mean, where the thing takes on a life of its own, and people say, wait a minute, here's this other project over here that's worthy of having a timeline with ticks on it that show, what the anniversaries are. It occurs to me that even versioning, which is a huge part of what we do with open source, it has an anniversary aspect to it, and there's a kind of rhythm to it as well, at least in some projects, in the way they roll forward. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that and answer that question.
Yeah, that's exactly why I think the Wikipedia will be the perfect place to have this, because of this nature that you can edit a milestone or you can add a milestone, and having people moderate that. And so right now, you can just suggest a milestone, and somebody is going to look at that, and they are either going to add that milestone or not. But if we could make it more like Wikipedia, where you can actually, in the actual timeline, add that, so you can open an overlay, and you can add that milestone, or you can edit a milestone, and somehow based on everybody's feedback, that could be added automatically, or it could be on a moderation queue. And we can even use AI, for example, to kind of arrange the timelines. So I mentioned the example of the history of Brazil, that you can say, summarize to me what's the history of Brazil in 20 milestones, or summarize to me the history of Linux in 10 milestones. What were the major milestones that happened that made Linux what it is today? And somehow AI, I think, could do that based on the feedback from a combination of what people added or what people said was an important milestone, and resources found on the internet.
Boy, and AI could really make for some interesting correlations that make no sense. Like the timeline where Shawn got his first car is also the same time that Linux was released to the... I'm pretty sure that's a causal effect. I'm sorry, but to get back to the anniversary stuff, I'm curious, and we meant to ask this earlier, and I forgot all about it. Have there been any surprises along the way? And you're not allowed to say COVID. I mean, obviously that surprised the whole world. But are there any things that have gone differently than you expected, either for the good or for the bad, doing the anniversary stuff that has been going on?
Yeah, so while studying the milestones and the timelines, I found some very interesting aspects. So if I were to ask for you, for example, what is the most important year in the tech history? What would you say?
Well, let's see.
Opinion.
The year I graduated from college.
Year?
No, just kidding.
I would say.
No, I mean, not in a personal level. I mean, in
93 is important. I think that's when the web really went online. Wasn't that it? Was it 93 when World Wide Web became a thing?
Yeah. So it was not. So that's actually one very important milestone in 91, and that's exactly 91. 30 years ago. So for me, realizing this, so we're in August right now. Exactly 30 years ago, both the web, the World Wide Web, and the Linux operating system, they were announced. This month, August, 30 years ago. So imagine that. So for me, the most important year in the whole tech history is 1991, exactly 30 years ago. Because it was a perfect combination. At one end, we had Linus developing Linux and announcing that. And it was just supposed to be a hobby project, nothing big, as he said on the user group. And also at the other end, we had Tim Berners-Lee announcing the World Wide Web. And these two movements, they would collide and they will create a very powerful combination. And so perhaps the next most important year for me would be just 3-4 years down the line in 1999, when we had the formation of the LAMP stack. So Linux was already part of that. And other projects that happened in 1995 was the Apache server, MySQL, PHP, and on the client side, JavaScript. So realizing that while studying and while creating those timelines, I came to realize how important that is and how everything happened together and in how it works, right? So I think that's one of the beauties of creating those timelines and studying those timelines, realizing how everything happened. And perhaps if Linux didn't happen, or if the web didn't happen, we will have a very different world right now. And very proprietary, or I don't know.
So talking about making timelines, just a really quick question. This is from the back channel, IRC channel. You mentioned this is built on top of Drupal. Is this something that people can create their own timelines? I mean, would they need to use your install? And if it's not specific to the open source community, it certainly wouldn't make sense to be on your website. Is this, you said it's open source, is this somewhere that people could get this Drupal code somewhere? If they want to make their own timelines on like Shawn's journey through cheeses of the world or whatever timeline I want to create?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I actually started the code using pure HTML and CSS. It's available on my GitHub, so it's github.com/Nick Vidal, and you can actually see the timeline of JavaScript there, and the timeline of the Apache server. And if you were to, and that codes, that CSS, that HTML, I just created a theme for Drupal, and I'm happy to launch that as open source. It's just a theme that you can use on Drupal, and from that you can create your own timelines. So I'll be open sourcing this for sure, but basically the whole design is available on the GitHub there. Oh yeah, we also have the cloud native. If you can click on that link there, nickvidal.github.io, yeah, that one. So that's the 5th anniversary of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And there you can see how Kubernetes came to be and how the whole CNCF was born. And that was pretty cool as well. And this whole code is available. It's just pure CSS, HTML, and a little bit of JavaScript. So it's very easy.
Awesome. Thank you. We'll be sure to include that down in the show notes too.
You have to take notes.
Oh, nice.
How many things you're going to list down there. It's really interesting you bring up the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, because when I went to their conference that Linux Foundation was putting on, like maybe 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, still for Linux Journal, I didn't realize how much it was. There were two things about it stood out for me. One is they have this really great hack that's a HTML hack, I guess. It's something, but it's on the web, and it allows you, it's called a landscape, and it allows you to turn on and off all the projects within it that are open source and aren't. But the most interesting thing to me about it is that a lot of what Cloud Native is about is 5G. It's what the little micro clouds you're going to have close to you, so you have low latency to clouds over 5G connections from your phone or your house or whatever else is going to be. And I've never heard mentioned anywhere, this is what happens with open source, a lot of what's actually going on is not what people hear about, right? You know, the cloud and little shards of clouds and micro clouds and things that are going to be close to you under low latency are a really big part of what 5G is going to be. And this is how And what the Linux Foundation does is it's kind of like the United Nations of warring companies that are warring at the proprietary level where they have all their secret sauce and customer lock-in at the top. But below that, it's like, wait a minute, we're all going to be working on the same thing here. It needs to be open and we'll all get there faster and we're going to have a better marketplace because we're all cooperating. And it's interesting to me that you're celebrating that because it's really an example of how otherwise disagreeable companies that are competing in the marketplace are actually getting along on stuff that they're not competing on. And that's becoming a bigger part, I would think, of what open source is doing. Are there any other projects like that that you see coming up that are worth celebrating or just worth recognizing in some way?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you think about cloud native being just 5 years old, that celebration actually happened like last year. But you can see everything that happened in this past 5 years, and it's a lot. There's just so many projects. It's really complex to really understand everything that has been happening around cloud native. And there's a lot going on, as you mentioned, 5G as well, edge computing. And so there are many timelines that we have to create. It's not just Linux anymore. There's a lot of things going on and happening. And I think those timelines will help people to understand what's happening and also to foresee the future and see how we can advance the technology. So something that I'm really excited about, I've joined this startup. It's on stealth mode right now, but it's around the confidential computing. And the Confidential Computing Consortium was created by the Linux Foundation in 2019. So it's barely 2 years now. And it's all about creating, about protecting data. So when we think about protecting data, we think about protecting data in transit. So from one server to another or to the client server or vice versa. We think about data encrypted on the hard drive, either on the server side or the client side. But we don't actually think about encrypting data and protecting data while it's in use on the CPU. And this has been happening in the last few years. So AMD, Intel, even ARM, they're creating special CPUs that they can get this data and encrypt it and make sure that, for example, the health system or financial bank industries, they can send this data to the clouds and it's secure. The data is secure, is protected. There's a lot of regulation and they usually have to have that data on premise. But if we can enable this, and if we can create these markets, they'll be able to take advantage of the clouds while still at the same time protecting the data and making sure it's encrypted and it's private. So there's a whole bunch of things going on. I would like to create timelines for the whole Linux Foundation. There's a lot of interesting projects happening. So you're right. Right now it's all about collaborating and working together. Yeah,
that's fantastic. And I've been notified like several minutes ago that we were out of time, so I'm gonna rush into. We always close with some questions, with some closing questions that are kind of our control questions, and go through them very quickly. The first is, do you have anything to say about blockchain at all, especially if it's brief? There are probably timelines there, I'm sure.
Yeah, so we have to create a timeline for blockchain and cryptocurrencies. We don't have that. So if somebody's hearing that and they're interested in that, please get in touch. Let's create a timeline for that.
Excellent. I love that. That may be the best answer to that question we've had so far. And the two others are, what are your favorite scripting language and text editor?
So I'm using Visual Studio Code, and my favorite language, I I've been a very long Drupal developer, so I love PHP. I know people like to bash PHP, but PHP is an evolving language and has been growing, and it's very popular. But I also enjoy JavaScript very much and TypeScript. And right now, I have to learn Rust, so let's see what happens there.
And I thank you so much for being on the show. And I want to thank my wife especially, because she's the one who met you first and suggested having you on the show. And she was very enthused.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, she was very enthused about you and what you're doing. So I appreciate that. She's been with Linux Journal since before I was, and that goes back to the early 90s. Nice. So so yeah, and I want to promote next week when we have James Vasile on. James is an old friend. I met him through the Freedom Box, I think. I was at a Freedom Box thing that when Evan Moglen and friends came up with the Freedom Box. But he's working now with Open Text Strategies, and he's good. He's an exciting dude. And so show up next week. I'll be in a completely other part of the country then, and my background will be different. I'll have a different shirt on, all the rest of it. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining us again, and we'll see you next week.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? I am Ant Pruitt, and I want to tell you about my show, Hands on Photography, here on TWiT TV. Each and every week, Thursday that is, I like to sit down and share with you the best tips and tricks that are going to help make you a better photographer. And it's not always about Photoshop. It's not always about just having the biggest and baddest and bestest camera. It can be the simplest of things, like leave your eye open when you're looking through the viewfinder. All of these simple tips can really help step your photography game up. So subscribe to the show today. That's twit.tv/hop. And I look forward to talking to you soon.